Okay, we're going to talk about both chapters 4 and 5 in this PowerPoint. So we're going to look at design, and we're looking at quantitative, qualitative, experimental, and quasi-experimental design. So to start us off, we're going to look at qualitative design, and really qualitative study is foundational. We're examining phenomena, or gaining insight. We're looking at the human experience. So we're really seeking to gain baseline knowledge so that we can further refine our studies. And very often qualitative studies are done prior to quantitative studies so that there's direction on what really needs to be measured, or metrics need to be involved in measuring certain components of the big picture as far as qualitative design. And really qualitative is really helpful to find insights as far as what those maybe one's perspective may be about an illness, or it may gain insight into some of the health disparities, what is going on in folks' lives that impacts their health outcomes, those types of things. So we're looking very broad and really non-linear, because it's qualitative design isn't necessarily to mean that from point A you go to point B. It's really to examine a bigger picture, so to speak. When we go into quantitative design, we're looking at verification. We're looking at quantifying things, doing some sort of measurement. And as I alluded to earlier, qualitative isn't necessarily linear. Quantitative tends to be linear and very regimental. Systematic and controlled. One of the nuances of some of the higher level studies are those randomized control trials, those types of things. So quantitative study can be experimental or non-experimental, and sometimes quantitative is more of a descriptive. So you're describing something based on measurements. So that's kind of the difference between experimental and non-experimental. So when we look at overall comparison of quantitative and qualitative, we're looking at different purposes or a different goal. So this is actually from your textbook. So I would like you to spend some diligent time, because it helps to differentiate the two types of, predominant types, I should say, of nursing research. So really look at the differences and know that each has a very deliberate purpose in research, and we need to know what our topics are and what we seek to gain in order to determine what type of design we really want to apply to our topic. So keep that in mind, and keep that inquisitive mind going, and keep asking questions. So when we dive into experimental design, very often we have control groups. The design is to help to reduce bias, so there's not other things going on. But when there's the human experience, there's always factors that aren't exactly the same within groups, and usually we try to control for those differences and consider those differences when we're looking at the results or the statistics. So we have to make sure that the experiment is as valid as possible, but there are factors that always must be considered. Things like history, what happened at the same time as the experiment may have impacted the experiment. Maturation, a 20-year-old may not have the same results as a 40-year-old, and how normal events of life actually expand over time. So again, there tends to be controls over age ranges or different possibly racial differences, or male, female, or gender issues. We also need to look at how we're testing And if we're doing a pre and a post test, the pre-test, knowing what those test questions were may impact the post-test, those types of things. So we must always look at research with a very critical eye and look at what may go wrong and try to prevent those issues from occurring. So another thing is some concerns as far as instrumentation. There may be different interpretation of rating scales between individuals, like when we use different types of scales, and say something as simple as what we weigh on. If the scales are calibrated, if there's two different locations or two different control groups using different scales, those are things to really examine as well. Look at how the groups are selected, how they're assigned to groups, who's in the control and who's in the experimental group. Are they the same type of person with the same maybe demographics, those types of things. Always look at how the groups are selected, and there's also effects on if we know we're in an experiment, it may impact how we react to a certain stimulus or a certain intervention. So all of those factors are things to have that critical eye when you're reading and looking at the design process. So when we're looking at quasi-experimental, it's not quite as rigorous as the experimental design, not as rigid, so to speak. Possibly it may be the same type of experimental design, but maybe it didn't have randomization, or there may be two or more interventions that may be tested at the same time. Therefore, it isn't a cause and effect, or we can't determine that. There may only be one group, not a control group. There may be one group that only there's a post-test, so there's no comparison factor. So all of those things are considerations. And as we're tying up for this particular, or for these two chapters, always know the design and know that different designs have different uses. There is a purpose for different types of design, and there are reasons why researchers use a particular design, or project leads use a particular structure for the project. And that's the most important thing, that the choice as far as the design is appropriate for that particular research topic or that particular project. Also look at the strength of the evidence, and really some of the strength can be actually put in context as far as the type of design. Very often meta-analysis are of higher level than a case study, because a case study only covers one individual. The level of evidence may be stronger if there's a huge population that's studied, or that it's a broad study over a great geographical area, that it has different folks. And that can also be a consequence too, that they're not comparing apples to apples when they're doing two different groups, as one being the control group and one being the experimental group. So there has to be some sort of way to actually normalize or balance the two groups. So if one group is different than the other, then the results aren't necessarily as strong as if there were controls for the differences. So again, always ask those very critical questions, have your critical lenses on when you're reading research, and also when you're trying to decide what type of design to use for your particular project or research. So with that being said, if you have any questions, let me know. But this, again, will help you as you're moving forward in this course. Keep this in mind as you're going to do some of your future assignments as far as your mini research, those types of things. So thank you very much, and take care now.